I'm not a big fan of Total War Warhammer. I think I've mentioned this before in some of my videos, but my main gripe with the game is that I just think it's too complicated for where I am right now in my gaming career. It doesn't really give me the feeling of what I want from a Warhammer Fantasy game, and I think that's okay. It's perfectly valid to enjoy playing these games, more power to you if you do, but I think when we think about this game and its legacy, Total Warhammer has been a blessing for those interested in Warhammer Fantasy and the old world. A great example of this is, of course, Cathay. Cathay, Warhammer Fantasy's version of medieval China, was never supported by Games Workshop with official minis, let alone anything that resembled an actual army book. So Creative Assembly have had creative freedom to really fabricate a lot of their roster as they wish. It's interesting to see that this army is actually being really fleshed out. I hope that one day, if Games Workshop decides to make a Cathay line, that they build upon the excellent work that has been done thus far. However, there are some areas where the requirements and concessions required of a Total War game butt into the established norms and reality for Warhammer Fantasy. In today's video, I'm going to talk about one of those situations, the most curious case of how many steam tanks there actually are. Before I begin this video in earnest, I'd like to request that if you've ever actually used a steam tank on the tabletop, or if you've been on the receiving end of one, please let me know about how that experience went in the comments below. I'm always curious to see exactly how people's perception of minis actually might differ from maybe a theoretical understanding of them. Personally, I've used steam tanks a total of 2 times in my life. One in a game where I had a steam tank, and one in a game where I fought against one. And I think that younger me found that the steam tank's psychological utility was a lot more useful than its actual utility. That is, as soon as you put down a steam tank on the table, I think a lot of people, especially more inexperienced Warhammer players, start to kind of freak out a little bit. Probably because it looks like a tank in a medieval fantasy game, but also I think because steam tanks had, at least, in Warhammer 8th edition, a reputation for being, more serious than they actually were. When it comes to the steam tanks in the actual army list, though, I think that there's basically 2 extremes regarding their prevalence. On one side, which is the side of the established lore from Games Workshop, there are only ever 12 steam tanks that have been built, and they were all built by the Chilean genius Leonardo of Merigliano. Because Leonardo disappears mysteriously, only 12 steam tanks were ever actually built, 4 of which have been lost or otherwise destroyed, leaving the grand total of steam tanks available to the Empire at just 8. In a bit of lore that sounds almost like Warhammer 40k, the secrets of making steam tanks are quote-unquote lost forever, and the Empire must make precious use of the remaining 8 tanks. Should one ever actually be lost or destroyed, all effort must be made to recover and repair that vehicle. Sounds very much like the AdMech, doesn't it? Thankfully, the engineers of the Empire are pretty adept at rebuilding any destroyed tanks. In this version of the lore, steam tanks are incredibly rare and precious vehicles that you should only ever use in the most dire of circumstances. Just what those circumstances are, don't ask me, since you can field a steam tank in your Empire army list if you have the points for it, regardless of whether or not you are fighting for the very Empire's survival, or if you're just seeing off a random patrol of orcs on the border of Averland. At the other extreme, which of course comes from Total War Warhammer, steam tanks are buildable units. If you have the Engineers Guildhall building, then you can make a steam tank, and you can theoretically make as many steam tanks as you can afford. In fact, the Wikipedia entry makes no mention of their rarity or the impossibility of their construction. From this perspective, steam tanks are expensive, yes, but not impossibly rare war machines. In fact, for comparison, a steam tank costs 1,000 at the time of writing, 1,900 gold, whereas a unit of Empire Swordsmen costs a mere 375. So, nothing really exorbitant, I would say. The question is, which of these perspectives is the correct one? At first glance, I think there's a lot of you that might default to the suggestion that the tabletop lore is actually the correct one. Since I've been in the hobby, steam tanks were always described as rare and precious things. They were not meant to be trifled with, but they were also unreliable and risky. The video game makes them seem positively tame by comparison. In fact, none of the infamous unreliability of the steam tank is even represented in the mechanics of the games. I think it would be incredibly fiddly to add those mechanics to the game engine, but I also think that it gives players the wrong perception about exactly what steam tanks actually are. Because of course, the steam tank is unreliable as a function of how it's actually made. It's not something that is meant to be considered to be reliable because it's an incredibly complicated piece of machinery. I also think that because steam tanks don't have any of their famous reliability issues, it also means that the in-game steam tanks shouldn't be as destructive because they don't have those drawbacks that are normally how you mitigate some of the problems with steam tanks. I think it's quite obvious, of course, why the games have made this decision. Units melt incredibly quickly in Total War Warhammer. Having something that can only ever have 8 copies ever would basically all but guarantee that it would never be used. Losing one of your 8 tanks in a game that could last dozens of hours would be a terrible experience. Not to mention, the real-time nature of the game makes it very hard to incorporate the more flavorful parts about how steam tanks are traditionally operated. I know I can't be the only one who's ever had the tremendous anxiety of trying to hope that the steam tank generates just enough steam points to actually get it to do something. And I get it. I like to grumble too. A lot of the videos on this channel are me just grumbling at things. But let's think about this for a second. What a steam tank actually is, at its heart, is just a giant boiler that builds up steam. This is not some radical lost technology. In fact, the ancient Greeks understood the principles of steam engines, thousands of years ago. While I certainly believe that the actual mechanism of a steam tank would be well beyond the comprehension of the average citizen of the Empire, it's mentioned in the lore that steam tanks are frequently lost and destroyed in combat, and then they are rebuilt by the College of Engineers. Of course, that means that if they can rebuild a steam tank, in theory, no matter how badly it gets destroyed, surely they should be able to then replicate that design. A big part of the source for all of this lore comes from White Dwarf 262, which contains a full write-up of the steam tank by Anthony Reynolds. The magazine covered the steam tank to, of course, coincide with the release of the model, and you can see a couple of variations of steam tanks that have been established now in the lore, of course, including a basic working set of lore that the steam tank has essentially had since its introduction. And in that source, it stated that steam tanks are not only rebuilt after being destroyed, but that many of them are often subject to improvements from the College of Engineers. So, while I could question the academic stability of the College of Engineers, I'm pretty sure they could definitely explain the basic mechanisms of a steam engine to their students. And if they can do that, and they can rebuild steam tanks, why can't they make more? There's a book, Emperor's Wrath, which is a source book for Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game. So the canonicity of this book is debatable depending on who you ask. There are some people who think that the only canon basically is what's written by Games Workshop specifically for the purposes of the tabletop wargame. Some people question the canonicity of the Warhammer Fantasy tabletop role-playing game. I think it's for the most part fairly canonical, although I do think that some parts of that game definitely don't jive with the rest of the canon. I think it's a case of picking and choosing, maybe, but that's, again, a debate for another time. So, in the sourcebook, Emperor's Wrath, it suggests that in 249.9 IC, the engineers of Nuln managed to actually make a prototype steam tank of their own. This was an ingenious design that they had fabricated, essentially inspired by other actual steam tanks. But, importantly for our story, that steam tank was destroyed under mysterious circumstances. Anthony Reynolds himself suggests that Leonardo could have in fact been assassinated because the steam tank might have heralded a change in society, in warfare, in the very fabric of the world that other people might not have wanted. So I think these 2 points are data points that point towards some kind of conspiracy. A conspiracy that keeps steam tanks around because they're useful, but also prevents them from being refined or improved or even just mass manufactured, because that would change too much about the setting, and we obviously know that there's some feudal lord somewhere who really doesn't want tanks to be around because that would make his cavalry kind of obsolete. I know it makes some sort of sense, but I don't necessarily buy this theory, alright? The mass availability of gunpowder weapons in the Empire is already a shakeup to the status quo, and yet no one works to undermine the availability of black powder weapons. Despite the fact that black powder weapons, their mere existence, already places up a limited time on how long feudalism could be sustained, doesn't mean anything with regards to how the rest of the setting works. Things that exist in Warhammer just exist. The idea that they will continue to exist in perpetuity, I think, is probably a staple of the setting. So, we have steam tanks, which exist in a setting where massive beasts of war are regularly included in armies, but here we are quibbling about a fairly unreliable vehicle with a fairly tame set of weapons. It's not like every shot from a steam tank auto-kills its targets. The Imperial Great Cannon has a much better kill rate than the actual steam tank cannon by virtue of the fact that the Great Cannon hits at strength 10. It's just a weaker version of the Imperial existing Great Cannons. So I think it's like when you consider what Chaos Dwarves are capable of building. I really doubt that more steam tanks would upset the status quo of the Empire all that much. I don't think you necessarily need to be able to mass manufacture them. I think that steam tanks could still be expensive and difficult and unreliable, but that you could definitely keep making them, right? Maybe you could hint in the future that maybe, just maybe, that the steam tank could be something someday, that somehow this would revolutionize warfare. But that day is, of course, very far away and buried under the pile of rubble generated by increasingly unreliable boiler explosions. Technology is a bit of a strange thing in Warhammer Fantasy. A lot of people quibble about it for some reason, when the explicit text of the game tells us all that technology is not as decisive as it appears. In our world, a society of Iron Age people would never be able to routinely pose a threat to near-industrial people, and yet, the Warriors of Chaos routinely threaten to do just that to their southern neighbors. Imagine just for a second if people who lived like 10th century Danes were to go up against the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century. I think it'd be laughable on the face of it that a highly organized society with firearms would be threatened by people so starved for resources that mail armor is a luxury to them. So to address this imbalance, I think Warhammer has added magic and monsters and all other kinds of things until the scales are more or less on balance. And this is the default way that the game handles all issues. The beastmen just always have enough beasts that are strong enough to overturn a castle wall, despite of course lacking any and all capacity for real sustained siegecraft. Do not get me started on the orcs. I said in my Empire vs. the Alliance video that the Empire is at a decisive technological disadvantage against the Alliance. I still believe that. One of the main reasons is of course that the Empire only has 8 steam tanks, according to the lore, but the Alliance can just build infinite siege engines in theory, right? In the course of a single game in Warcraft 3, you'll definitely build more than 8 steam tanks. Mind, of course, the Alliance siege engine is a relatively tame sort of vehicle. It is a short-range cannon and, that's about it. And this, of course, is in a game where other siege units hurl everything from stones to freshly killed corpses. So, I don't think making the steam tank less precious or rare would really be that much of an upset to the status quo that other people might think it is. It's not like the average Imperial citizen would be driving around in one. Warhammer Fantasy is stuck in a sort of industrial limbo, always on the cusp of a great transformation, but never quite getting there. So I think it would be worth examining the potential changes to the setting of the game if an industrial revolution were to take place, and what that might mean for the setting. But again, that's something for another video. If that sounds appealing to you, you let me know in the comments below. So, the point of this is to basically argue that steam tanks are actually not as special as they're meant to be in the lore. I think that the status quo can survive a few more lumbering lumps of steel and iron. Thank you for watching this video. Remember to like and subscribe. I have to admit that it's good to be making videos again. I have been very sick for quite a while, and I'm still dealing with the lingering effects of the cough, so if this video seems a bit more edited than my normal videos, that's because I'm trying to remove all the coughing. I do hope I've done it, though. Thank you all for your continued support of this channel. I understand that it's not necessarily been the best quality or the most number of videos or anything like that, but I do appreciate all the support that it gets. It is a good escape for me to have something like this from the hustle and bustle of my regular work. And I love talking about Warhammer and war games and tabletop stuff and all that jazz. And I'm not ever expecting this channel to be massive or whatever, but it is genuinely nice that people actually watch these videos and comment on them and stuff like that. I've got a couple more videos in the works. I do want to talk about things like House of the Dragon and, to some extent, A Song of Ice and Fire more on this channel. It's been something I've been thinking about a lot lately. But I've also got a couple of other projects in the works, including, of course, another video that's going to be out about another game that I'm working on, another tabletop game. So I hope that everybody's doing well. Take care and goodbye.